Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in the rugged hills of Corsica, an island caught between Italian heritage and growing French influence. His family, the Bonapartes, were of modest nobility, proud, ambitious, and fiercely Corsican. Yet the world he would soon reshape lay far beyond the shores of his birthplace. As a boy, Napoleon was sent to mainland France for schooling, stepping into a country whose language he barely spoke and whose customs he did not yet understand. But he adapted quickly. In 1785, at just 16, he completed his studies at a French military academy and became a young officer in the Royal Army. His rise would not be easy. France was a nation on the edge of upheaval, but his ambition burned brighter than the turmoil around him. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, sweeping aside royal power and rewriting old traditions, Napoleon recognized opportunity. He supported the revolutionary cause and used the chaos of the era to climb through the ranks. His breakthrough came in 1793 when he led French forces to victory at the Siege of Toulon. That triumph turned him from an unknown artillery officer into a rising national hero. 2 years later, in 1795, when royalist rebels threatened Paris, Napoleon acted swiftly and decisively. His success in crushing the uprising earned him fame and influence in the new republic. Soon after, he was placed in command of the French armies in Italy. In 1796, he launched a brilliant military campaign against Austria and its Italian allies, winning battle after battle. His victories did more than expand French territory. They electrified the nation. Newspapers praised him, soldiers adored him, and rivals feared him. In 1798, he struck out once more, this time leading an ambitious expedition into Egypt and Syria. Though the campaign was difficult and ultimately incomplete, it strengthened his reputation and provided the stepping stone he needed for political power. By November 1799, France was exhausted by years of revolution, corruption, and instability. Sensing the moment, Napoleon orchestrated the coup of 18 Brumaire, toppling the failing Directory. At only 30 years old, he became first consul of France, the most powerful position in the land. Power, however, was never enough for him. After securing victory against the Second Coalition in 1800 at the Battle of Marengo and solidifying his political control, he turned to reshaping France itself. In 1803, he sold the vast Louisiana territory to the United States, strengthening the French treasury. And in December 1804, in a moment that symbolized his unshakable ambition, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. The age of Napoleon had begun. Napoleon Bonaparte's story began long before his birth, woven through the roots of two proud Italian families who had found their way to Corsica generations earlier. His father's line, the Bonapartes, came from Tuscany, minor nobles who carried with them old traditions, ambition, and a fierce sense of identity. His mother's family, the Ramolinos, traced their heritage back to Lombardy, giving the young Napoleon a lineage tied to two of Italy's historic regions. Carlo Maria Buonaparte and Maria Letizia Ramolino, strong-willed and determined, built their life together in the Maison Bonaparte in Ajaccio. It was there, on August 15, 1769, that their second son, Napoleone di Buonaparte, entered the world. The family grew quickly. Joseph, the eldest, Lucien, Elisa, Louis, Pauline, Caroline, and Jérôme. 7 surviving children in all. 5 more were lost in infancy, a common tragedy of the time, which shaped the fierce resilience of the Bonaparte household. Napoleon was born at a turning point in Corsican history. Only a year earlier, the island had been formally ceded to France by the Republic of Genoa. Many Corsicans resisted this transfer, and Carlo had been among those who fought under the famed patriot Pasquale Paoli in the War for Independence. But after the defeat at the Battle of Ponte Novo and Paoli's exile to Britain, Carlo changed course. He forged a friendship with Charles Louis de Marbeuf, the French governor, who soon became a mentor to the family and even served as Napoleon's godfather. Through Marbeuf's influence, Carlo was appointed Corsica's representative to the court of King Louis XVI, a prestigious position that opened doors for his children. For Napoleon, the most important opportunity came in the form of a royal scholarship that granted him a place at a military academy in France. That would be the beginning of a life far removed from the rocky Corsican hills of his childhood. Yet it was his mother, Maria Letizia, who shaped him most profoundly. She was strict, disciplined, and unyielding, qualities that Napoleon later claimed forged his character. "The future destiny of the child is always the work of the mother," he once said, acknowledging the strength that defined his earliest years. In 1779, at just 9 years old, Napoleon left Corsica for the mainland of France. His first stop was a religious school in autumn, where he struggled with French, a language that was not his own. His native tongues were Corsican and Italian. His accent marked him as an outsider, and his imperfect spelling and speech only drew more attention to the fact that he was foreign. Soon afterward, he transferred to the military academy at Brienne-le-Château. There, surrounded by aristocratic children who mocked him for his accent, short stature, and awkward mannerisms, Napoleon withdrew into himself. Books became his companions. He devoured works on history and geography and showed an exceptional talent for mathematics. So much so that his examiners predicted he might make an excellent naval officer. Legends later claimed that Napoleon displayed early leadership in a dramatic snowball fight, where he supposedly organized the younger boys into a disciplined force and triumphed over the older students. Whether this story was true or simply invented after he became famous, it reflected how people viewed him, a natural commander, even in childhood. During his years at Brienne, his Corsican identity only deepened. He admired Pasquale Paoli, the exiled patriot, and spoke passionately of Corsican independence. But life was pulling him in another direction. In September 1784, Napoleon earned admission to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. It was here that he trained as an artillery officer. Again, his brilliance in mathematics set him apart, and he read widely, absorbing history, geography, science, and literature. He still struggled with French and knew only a little German, but his intellectual drive compensated for his linguistic shortcomings. When his father died suddenly in early 1785, the family income collapsed. Napoleon had to finish the 2-year military program in a single year. It was a tremendous challenge, but he rose to it. In September 1785, he passed his final examination under the supervision of the renowned scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace. At just 16, Napoleon became the first Corsican to graduate from the École Militaire, and he emerged as a young artillery officer ready to step into a nation on the brink of revolution. When Napoleon Bonaparte graduated from the École Militaire in September 1785, he was only 16 years old, young, driven, and already carrying the ambition that would later reshape Europe. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the prestigious La Fère Artillery Regiment and began his military career stationed in the towns of Valence and Auxonne. These early years were marked by discipline, study, and long hours of drilling. But they were also filled with extended visits back to Corsica. His homeland continued to exert a strong pull on him. Every return to the island strengthened his attachment to its struggles and stoked the fierce Corsican nationalism he had carried since childhood. Though he wore a French uniform, a part of him still dreamed of Corsican independence. Everything began to change in 1789 when the French Revolution erupted. France plunged into turmoil as royal authority crumbled and revolutionary factions clashed for control. Napoleon, sensing that history was moving in a new direction, returned to Corsica in September of that year. There, he threw himself into the political upheavals of the island, supporting the revolutionary ideals spreading across Europe. In 1790, the exiled Corsican patriot Pasquale Paoli, once Napoleon's childhood hero, returned to the island. But Paoli viewed the Bonaparte family with suspicion. He believed Napoleon's father had betrayed the cause of Corsican independence when he aligned with the French, and Paoli carried that resentment into his dealings with the son. The admiration that Napoleon had once felt for him began to falter. Corsica soon became a battleground of clashing loyalties. Royalists who opposed the revolution, Corsican nationalists who wanted independence, and revolutionaries who sought to tie the island's future to France. Napoleon stepped into this volatile struggle, aligning himself with the Jacobins and the pro-French Corsican Republicans. He believed Corsica's future was intertwined with France, not separate from it. His political stance earned him both influence and enemies. In 1792, he was placed in command of a battalion of Corsican volunteers and promoted to captain in the French army, despite being away from his regiment longer than allowed, and despite a bitter conflict between his Corsican volunteers and the French troops stationed in Ajaccio. Napoleon's ambition was beginning to test the limits of traditional military authority. The following year brought disaster. In February 1793, Napoleon participated in a French attempt to capture Sardinia, but the operation failed. Rumors began to circulate that Paoli had sabotaged the expedition, pointing to corruption, mismanagement, or even betrayal. The French National Convention soon acted, declaring Paoli an outlaw. Corsica erupted into open conflict. In early June, Napoleon led 400 French soldiers in an attempt to seize Ajaccio from Corsican nationalist forces, but the effort collapsed. Paoli's supporters regained control of the island, leaving the Bonaparte family in grave danger. The final blow came when Napoleon learned that the Corsican Assembly had officially condemned him and his entire family as enemies of the island. The Buonaparte had no choice. They fled Corsica under threat of death, boarding a ship bound for the French mainland. As their vessel carried them across the sea toward Toulon, Napoleon watched the island of his childhood fade into the distance. Corsica, once the center of his identity, had turned its back on him. And so, driven out of his homeland and stripped of the future he once imagined, he stepped more firmly into the destiny awaiting him in revolutionary France. After fleeing Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte returned to his regiment in Nice, determined to rebuild his future in France. Despite the turmoil of recent years, opportunity soon found him. He was assigned command of a coastal artillery battery, modest, but enough to put his talents to work. His sharp mind and political instincts were also on display. In July 1793, he published a fiery pamphlet titled Le Souper de Beaucaire, in which he openly supported the National Convention, then dominated by the powerful Jacobin faction. The pamphlet showed not only his loyalty, but also his growing skill at shaping public opinion. Later that year, fortune turned in his favor. Through the influence of Antoine Christophe Salicetti, a fellow Corsican who recognized Napoleon's potential, he was appointed chief artillery officer for the Republican forces attempting to retake the strategic port city of Toulon. The city had fallen into the hands of royalists who had invited British and Spanish forces to occupy the harbor. It was a dire situation for the revolution and a chance for Napoleon to distinguish himself. Upon arriving, he threw himself into the task with relentless energy. He expanded the artillery force, organized its deployment with mathematical precision, and studied the enemy fortifications with a keen eye. He soon identified a crucial vulnerability, a hill overlooking the harbor. If the Republicans could seize that position, they could place their cannons there and threaten the Allied ships below, forcing them to abandon the port. Napoleon presented the plan, bold and risky, and pushed for its approval. Once accepted, he personally oversaw the preparations. In mid-December 1793, over 2 brutal days, December 16th and 17th, the assault began. Through smoke, musket fire, and the thunder of cannons, the Republicans stormed the hill and drove out the defenders. As Napoleon predicted, the Allied fleets had no choice but to evacuate. Toulon was reclaimed. The victory changed everything. Word of Napoleon's brilliance spread rapidly. His bold tactics and decisive leadership came to the attention of influential figures, including Augustin Robespierre, the brother of Maximilien Robespierre, the most powerful Jacobin in France. In recognition of his success, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. At only 24 years old, he was already rising far above other officers of his age. He was soon placed in charge of defending the Mediterranean coastline, a significant responsibility for someone still new to the general's rank. In February 1794, he was appointed chief artillery commander of the Army of Italy, where he quickly began devising strategies against the Kingdom of Sardinia, France's enemy across the mountains. His plans were not merely theoretical. In April 1794, the French army put them into action in the Second Battle of Sargio. Napoleon's strategy allowed French forces to seize control of the mountain passes, outmaneuvering the Austro-Sardinian troops who guarded them. They pushed forward to capture the key town of Ormia, then swung westward, threatening to encircle the enemy's positions near Sarga. These victories marked the beginning of Napoleon's transformation from a promising young officer into one of the most brilliant strategic minds of his time. After the campaign, Augustin Robespierre entrusted him with a delicate diplomatic mission. He was to travel to the Republic of Genoa and assess its intentions toward France. It was a sign that Napoleon's abilities were now recognized not only on the battlefield, but also in political and diplomatic circles. He was rising quickly, and more challenges, more dangers, and more opportunities were waiting just ahead. The political tides in France shifted violently after the fall of Maximilien Robespierre in July 1794. The Jacobins, once the dominant revolutionary faction, now found themselves hunted and discredited. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had risen to prominence partly through Jacobin support, suddenly became a target of suspicion. His past connections marked him as dangerous to the new government. On August 9, 1794, he was arrested. It could easily have been the end of his career, and perhaps his life. But the charges were vague, and he had powerful supporters who remembered Toulon. After 2 tense weeks, he was released. Though free, he was no longer favored by the shifting revolutionary authorities. Yet France still desperately needed skilled officers. Napoleon was asked to help prepare plans for military operations against Italy, and in early 1795, he was assigned to an expedition aimed at retaking Corsica from the British. It failed. The Royal Navy crushed the French attempt, and Napoleon had to confront the bitter truth that the island of his birth was forever lost to him. Around this time, another story quietly blossomed. Napoleon fell into a romantic relationship with Désirée Clary, a young woman from Marseille whose sister was married to his brother Joseph. Napoleon's letters to her revealed a softer, more sentimental side, one rarely seen in his later years. He even wrote a short romantic novella, Clisson et Eugénie, inspired by their relationship, telling the story of a soldier torn between love and duty. In April 1795, he was assigned to the Army of the West to help suppress the royalist uprising in the Vendée. But this was a demotion, infantry command instead of artillery, and Napoleon wanted no part of the brutal civil war raging there. Claiming poor health, he avoided the posting. The government was not pleased. By September, he had been struck off the list of active generals for refusing to serve. His career was crumbling. Desperate, Napoleon even sought permission to leave France entirely and serve as an instructor to the Ottoman army under Sultan Selim III. The request was approved, but events soon changed his fate before he ever left Europe. In the late summer of 1795, Paris began to boil once more. On October 3rd, Royalists mounted a rebellion, determined to overthrow the National Convention. Paul Barras, one of the new leaders of France, searched for someone capable of defending the government. He remembered Toulon, and he remembered Napoleon. Napoleon was appointed second in command of the forces guarding the Tuileries Palace. He had been inside the palace 3 years earlier during the bloody fall of the Swiss Guards. He knew exactly what artillery could do. Acting with characteristic speed, he ordered a young, energetic cavalry officer named Joachim Murat to seize a cache of cannons. Napoleon positioned these guns strategically across key streets in Paris. And on October 5, 1795, known in the revolutionary calendar as 13 Vendémiaire, Napoleon gave the order that would define his rise. He fired. Canister shot tore through the advancing royalist ranks. The streets filled with smoke and shouts. By the time the uprising ended, hundreds of rebels lay dead. Napoleon's ruthless efficiency saved the government and ensured his own survival. Historians later called it the whiff of grape shot, a moment when one decisive blast changed the course of French history. The Directory, the new ruling government, rewarded him handsomely. On October 26th, he was made commander of the Army of the Interior. Just months later, in January 1796, he received the appointment that would send him into legend, commander of the Army of Italy. But before leaving for the front, he embarked on another personal transformation. Within weeks of the Vendémiaire uprising, he became romantically involved with Joséphine de Beauharnais, the sophisticated widow and former mistress of Paul Béra. Joséphine was charming, worldly, and influential, everything Napoleon was not. He fell deeply in love. They married in a civil ceremony on March 9, 1796. Around this time, Napoleon abandoned the Italian spelling of his name and began calling himself what history would forever remember, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was ready to take command, ready to step fully into destiny, ready to reshape Europe. Two days after his marriage to Joséphine, Napoleon Bonaparte rode away from Paris, leaving behind the warmth of celebration for the cold uncertainty of war. He traveled south to assume command of the Army of Italy, a force poorly supplied, often hungry, and demoralized by years of stalemate. But Napoleon arrived with a fierce sense of purpose. He had promised the Directory victories, and he intended to deliver them. Upon taking command, he immediately went on the offensive. His strategy was bold: strike at the Kingdom of Sardinia in Piedmont before their Austrian allies could organize a rescue. In the Montanati campaign of April 1796, he executed a rapid series of maneuvers that shattered the Piedmontese defenses. Within 14 astonishing days, he forced them out of the war. This whirlwind of victories electrified France and stunned Europe. Next, he turned his gaze toward the Austrians, the true power in northern Italy. Mantua, a fortress city, became the hinge of the campaign. Napoleon laid siege to it, knowing that the Austrians would be compelled to send armies to break the encirclement. They did, and every time Napoleon met them, outthought them and defeated them. At Castiglione, he routed one Austrian relief army. At Bassano, he crushed another. Then came Arcole, where legend depicts him charging across a narrow bridge with a flag in hand, rallying his troops under heavy fire. Though the image is partly mythologized, it captures the essence of the campaign. Napoleon's audacity could move entire armies. The climax came at the Battle of Rivoli in January 1797. There, in the freezing mountains, the Austrians launched their greatest effort to save Mantua. Napoleon's strategy and artillery mastery overwhelmed them. Nearly half the Austrian force, 43% of its men, were killed, wounded, or captured. The collapse of Austrian power in Italy was total. Mantua surrendered soon after, sealing France's dominance. With northern Italy conquered, Napoleon pressed forward into the very heartlands of the Habsburg Empire. French forces in Germany had struggled against Archduke Charles, a respected military commander. But when Charles learned of Napoleon's unstoppable advance toward Vienna, he abandoned Germany to defend the capital. It was too late. In March 1797, Napoleon defeated Charles at the Battle of Tarvis, driving the Austrians backward in disarray. French troops pushed as far as Leoben, barely 100 kilometers from Vienna. The Habsburgs, shaken by the speed and precision of the French march, sued for peace before their capital could be threatened directly. The preliminary Peace of Leoben, signed on April 18, 1797, was a triumph for Napoleon. France gained control over most of northern Italy and the Low Countries. Austria agreed to partition the ancient Republic of Venice. When Napoleon marched into Venice, the 1,000-year-old republic fell without a fight. He allowed the French to seize its legendary treasures, including the fabled horses of St. Mark, which had stood for centuries atop the Venetian basilica. The scale of Napoleon's victories was unprecedented. During the campaign, his army captured 150,000 prisoners, 540 cannons, 170 standards, over 45 million francs in money, another 12 million in jewels and precious metals, more than 300 priceless artworks. The Army of Italy fought 67 actions and won 18 full-scale battles, a staggering record achieved through swift movement, ruthless discipline, superior artillery, and Napoleon's unrelenting drive. As the victories piled up, So did Napoleon's influence in French politics. He founded two newspapers, one for his soldiers, the other for readers across France, to shape his public image. His enemies accused him of looting Italy and warned that he might one day seize power for himself. Napoleon dismissed their fears but acted decisively to protect his growing authority. He sent General Charles-Pierre Augereau to Paris to support the coup of 18 Fructidor, which purged royalists from the government and strengthened the Directory. Still in Italy, Napoleon concluded the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria, which formalized French victories and redrew the map of Europe once again. He returned to Paris on December 5, 1797, to thunderous acclaim. Crowds celebrated him as a national hero. Politicians sought his favor. And in the midst of this triumph, Napoleon met Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the influential foreign minister who would become one of his most cunning allies. The Directory gave him his next assignment, command of the Army of England. France planned an ambitious invasion of Britain. Whether successful or not, it was clear one thing was certain. Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer merely a brilliant young general. He was becoming the central figure in France's destiny. Despite France's victories in Italy, Napoleon Bonaparte knew that an invasion of Britain was still out of reach. The Royal Navy dominated the seas, and France simply lacked the naval strength to challenge them head-on. After 2 months of intense planning, Napoleon proposed a bold alternative: strike at the British Empire indirectly by seizing Egypt. Control of Egypt, he argued, would open the way to India, the jewel of Britain's colonial empire, and allow France to disrupt British trade routes across the Middle East. In Napoleon's mind, the plan was even grander. He envisioned forging alliances with Indian rulers such as Tipu, Sultan of Mysore, another sworn enemy of the British. Once Egypt is conquered, he assured the Directory, I will join with the princes of India, and together we will drive the English from their possessions. Entranced by the idea of expanding French influence toward the Indian Ocean, the Directory approved the daring expedition. In May 1798, Napoleon was elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences, a sign of his growing reputation not only as a commander, but also as an intellectual. He took with him 167 scholars, scientists, engineers, and artists. Mathematicians, geologists, botanists, and linguists filled the expedition's ranks, ready to explore, measure, record, and study the ancient land. Their work would later culminate in the monumental Description de l'Égypte and would include the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, a key to unlocking ancient Egyptian writing. Sailing for Egypt, Napoleon first reached Malta on June 9th. The island, held by the Knights Hospitaller, surrendered almost immediately. With only token resistance, Napoleon captured a crucial naval base at the cost of just 3 French lives. From there, his fleet slipped past the pursuing Royal Navy and landed at Alexandria on July 1st, 1798. Egypt would become one of the most dramatic stages of Napoleon's career. Shortly after landing, he fought the Battle of Shubrikit against the Mamluks, the elite cavalry who dominated Egyptian military power. This skirmish allowed French troops to practice their new square formations, tight blocks of infantry bristling with bayonets. Just weeks later, these formations would prove decisive. On July 21st, near the shadow of the Great Pyramids, Napoleon faced a Mamluk army of equal size. The cavalry charges thundered across the sands, but the French squares held firm. When the battle ended, nearly 2,000 Egyptians lay dead. The French lost only 29 men. The Battle of the Pyramids shattered Mamluk power and boosted French morale to soaring heights. But victory on land would be overshadowed by disaster at sea. On August 1st, 1798, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson finally caught the French fleet at anchor in Aboukir Bay. In the devastating Battle of the Nile, the British annihilated almost the entire French navy. Only 2 French ships escaped. Napoleon's army was now stranded in Egypt, cut off from France. Still, the campaign continued. Rebellions flared in Cairo, and Ottoman forces gathered in distant provinces. In early 1799, determined to strike first, Napoleon marched north into the Ottoman territories of Syria and Galilee. with an army of 13,000 men. He captured the coastal towns of Arish, Gaza, Jaffa, and Haifa. But Jaffa became infamous. Upon discovering that many defenders were former prisoners of war who had violated their parole, Napoleon ordered them executed. Between 1,500 and 5,000 prisoners were killed, mostly by bayonet or drowning. Civilians suffered horribly. For 3 days, the city was looted and terrorized. Disease soon struck the French army, with bubonic plague ravaging the ranks. Napoleon failed to take the fortress of Acre, a critical objective. Exhausted, diseased, and low on supplies, the army retreated back toward Egypt. Rumors later spread that Napoleon ordered terminally ill soldiers to be given lethal doses of opium to hasten the withdrawal, a claim forever debated by historians but never conclusively proven. Back in Egypt, Napoleon won a final victory. On July 25, 1799, he crushed an Ottoman amphibious invasion at Abukir, restoring some measure of French prestige. But Europe was calling. News from the continent arrived. France was losing the War of the Second Coalition. Austria, Russia, and Britain were gaining ground. The Republic itself seemed at risk. Napoleon understood the implication immediately. If France fell, everything he had built would collapse with it. Seizing the moment and taking advantage of a temporary British withdrawal from French waters, he made a sudden and unauthorized decision. On August 24, 1799, he secretly boarded a ship and set sail for France. He left Egypt and his army behind. Command passed to General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, while Napoleon raced across the sea toward the destiny awaiting him: the collapse of the Directory, a new revolution, and the chance for absolute power. When Napoleon Bonaparte slipped out of Egypt in August 1799, he had no idea that the French Directory had actually ordered him to return months earlier. Britain threatened invasion, Austria was resurgent, and France desperately needed its most successful general, but the orders never reached him. His departure, though unauthorized, would prove perfectly timed. As Napoleon's ship sailed toward Europe, the balance of war shifted again. By the time he stepped onto the streets of Paris in October, the Republic had won several key victories. The immediate military danger had eased, but the political crisis had grown even worse. France was bankrupt. Inflation ravaged the economy, corruption infected every branch of government, and public trust in the Directory had collapsed. Most French citizens viewed the ruling council as weak, divided, and hopelessly ineffective. Though Napoleon had technically abandoned his army in Egypt, the French people welcomed him as a savior. Crowds cheered, newspapers praised him, and the failures of the Egyptian campaign were overshadowed by his reputation as the conqueror of Italy. The Directory briefly debated whether to punish him for desertion, but they were too weak and too unpopular to act. Napoleon sensed this vulnerability immediately and moved to exploit it. France was ready for change. Napoleon was ready to provide it. He began forming alliances quietly but decisively. His brother Lucien Bonaparte, president of the Council of 500, became a critical partner. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the master diplomat, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, the intellectual architect of earlier revolutions, Roger Ducos, another influential director, and Joseph Fouché, the cunning minister of police, all agreed that the Directory had to fall. Together, they devised a plan to dismantle the government and replace it with a new form of leadership, one dominated by Napoleon. The moment arrived on November 9th, 1799, 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar. Under the pretext of an imaginary Jacobin plot, Napoleon convinced the legislative councils to relocate to Saint-Cloud, just outside Paris. Once the councils were isolated, the conspirators put their plan into motion. Soldiers loyal to Napoleon filled the corridors. Debate turned to shouting. Confusion swept through the chambers. The next day, Napoleon entered the Council of 500 and attempted to persuade them to abolish the Directory. Instead, he was jeered, threatened, even physically attacked. For a moment, the coup seemed on the edge of collapse. Then the doors burst open. Grenadiers marched inside, bayonets fixed, led by Lucien Bonaparte. Under military pressure, the council dissolved the Directory. By evening, they appointed 3 provisional consuls to rule France: Napoleon Bonaparte, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, and Roger Ducos. The coup of 18 Brumaire was complete. In a matter of hours, the French Revolution had entered a new phase, not the restoration of monarchy, but the rise of a new kind of ruler. Napoleon, only 30 years old, now stood at the center of French power. The Republic had not yet ended, but its future now rested in the hands of one man. In the weeks that followed the coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon Bonaparte moved quickly to reshape France. On December 13, 1799, he introduced the Constitution of the Year 8, the framework for a new political order known as the Consulate. Though 3 consuls were appointed for 10-year terms, everyone understood the truth. Power rested almost entirely in the hands of one man. Napoleon ensured that his trusted allies, Jean-Jacques Cambacérès and Charles-François Lebrun, were chosen as the second and third consuls. They were experienced administrators, but under the new system, their roles were mostly advisory. Napoleon, as first consul, controlled military decisions, foreign policy, lawmaking, and appointments. The legislative body and tribunate, supposed representatives of the people, were selected through indirect elections, while the Senate and Council of State were effectively handpicked by the executive. To give the new constitution an aura of democratic legitimacy, a national plebiscite was held on February 7, 1800. The official results showed an overwhelming victory, more than 3 million in favor, with barely over 1,000 opposed. In reality, Napoleon's brother Lucien manipulated the numbers, doubling the yes votes to create the illusion of near-unanimous support. But the people believed the results, and enthusiasm for Napoleon's leadership surged. Historians would later describe the consulate in vivid terms: a dictatorship by plebiscite, a monarchy disguised in republican clothing, or a soft despotism. But to many in France at the time, Napoleon brought something they desperately needed: order. He centralized the administration, tightening control over local governments. Censorship expanded, and opposition newspapers were silenced. Those who accepted peace were granted amnesty. Insurrectionists who continued to resist faced ruthless repression. To stabilize France's finances, Napoleon raised taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and salt, and demanded heavy payments from satellite republics. He courted bankers, promising to safeguard private property while quietly increasing government revenue. Yet Napoleon knew his authority would never be secure without a decisive victory abroad. Peace, he believed, must be earned on the battlefield. In May 1800, he led an army across the Swiss Alps into Italy. The crossing was treacherous: narrow, icy passes, sudden avalanches, and mules struggling against steep cliffs. Yet Napoleon's daring move caught the Austrians off guard. On June 2nd, he seized Milan, reclaiming territory lost while he had been in Egypt. But Austria was not yet defeated. On June 14th, at the plains of Marengo, Napoleon faced an Austrian force of 30,000 men under General Michael von Melas. Napoleon commanded only 24,000, and the battle began disastrously. The Austrians launched a surprise attack at dawn, driving the French back mile by mile. By mid-afternoon, the French line was on the verge of collapse. Defeat seemed imminent. Then, in the dust of retreat, a messenger arrived with a crucial announcement. General Louis Desailles had returned to the field. Desailles led a fresh division straight into the Austrian flank. His charge reversed the entire tide of battle. Moments later, he was struck down and killed. But his attack bought France victory. The Austrians broke and fled, leaving 14,000 casualties on the battlefield. The next day, they signed an armistice, abandoning northern Italy once again. Napoleon had wrestled triumph from the brink of disaster. Marengo became a symbol of his luck, his audacity, and his destiny. The peace did not last long. Negotiations stalled, and by November 1800 the war resumed. This time, Napoleon entrusted General Jean-Victor Marie Moreau with leading French forces in Germany. Moreau marched into Bavaria and crushed the Austrians at the Battle of Hohenlinden in December. With their armies shattered on two fronts, Austria capitulated. The Treaty of Luneville, signed in February 1801, reaffirmed and expanded the earlier gains of Campo Formio. France now dominated much of Italy, the Rhineland, and the Low Countries. 1 year later, on January 26, 1802, Napoleon was formally declared president of the Italian Republic, further extending his influence. But success brought danger. Royalists still dreamed of restoring the monarchy. Jacobins plotted in shadows. Napoleon knew threats lurked both to his right and to his left. 2 assassination attempts, the Dagger Plot in October 1800 and the Rue Saint-Nicaise conspiracy shortly after, gave him justification to act. Around 100 Jacobins and Royalists were arrested. Some were executed, many deported to distant penal colonies. By the end of 1801, Napoleon had achieved what few leaders in revolutionary France ever managed: peace at home, victory abroad, and a consolidated grip on power. But the peace he created would be brief. The next stage of his ambition was already forming in his mind, something grander, more permanent, and far more dangerous. After nearly 10 years of upheaval and bloodshed, Europe finally tasted peace in March 1802. France and Britain, bitter enemies locked in war since the Revolution, signed the Treaty of Amiens, bringing the long conflict to a temporary halt. For the first time in years, French ports opened without fear of British cannon fire, and European merchants dared to hope for stability. Napoleon Bonaparte embraced the moment with theatrical flourish. He celebrated the end of hostilities and showcased another political achievement: the Concordat of 1801, an agreement he had forged with Pope Pius VII. The Concordat was designed to heal one of the deepest wounds of the Revolution: the bitter divide between the French state and the Catholic Church. Through it, the Pope recognized Napoleon's government, while France acknowledged Catholicism as the majority religion of the people. It was not pure reconciliation, but a shrewd balancing act. Napoleon restored religious peace while keeping control firmly in state hands. In a spirit of fusion, his term for national healing, Napoleon issued amnesties to thousands of émigrés who had fled during the Revolution. Aristocrats, former enemies, exiled families. All were invited to return, provided they swore loyalty to the new regime. France was weary of civil strife, and Napoleon presented himself as the leader who could bind the nation together. Peace and prosperity transformed his popularity. With the economy recovering, trade flowing, and military victories still fresh in public memory, admiration for Napoleon spread across Europe. Diplomats courted him. Newspapers praised him. Citizens celebrated him as the architect of stability. Emboldened by this rising support, the Council of State proposed a new plebiscite in May 1802. The question was simple, yet monumental. Should Napoleon Bonaparte become consul for life? For the first time, the regime used Napoleon's full first name, symbolizing a shift from temporary leadership to something closer to monarchy. The vote was overwhelming: 3.6 million yes to just 8,374 no. The turnout, between 40 and 60%, was the highest of any plebiscite since the Revolution began. France wanted Napoleon to stay, but peace did not erase the contradictions of his rule. Under the Treaty of Amiens, France regained its overseas colonies. There, Napoleon's ambitions collided with the ideals of the Revolution. In 1794, the National Convention had abolished slavery throughout the French Empire. But economic interests remained powerful, and in May 1802, Napoleon reinstated slavery in every recovered colony except 2, Saint-Domingue and Guadeloupe, which were still in open rebellion. A French expedition under General Antoine Reshaping brutally re-established control of Guadeloupe. Slavery was restored on July 16th. The island descended into violence and repression. Saint-Domingue, however, was different. It was the crown jewel of the French colonial economy, producing vast quantities of sugar, coffee, and indigo. But the island was under the control of Toussaint Louverture, the brilliant former slave who had freed the population and governed with remarkable discipline. Determined to reclaim the colony, Napoleon sent his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, at the head of 29,000 soldiers. They landed in February 1802. For months, the French fought a brutal campaign. Toussaint was betrayed, captured, and sent to France, where he died in prison. But diseases, especially yellow fever, ravaged the French army, and the rebel forces now rallied under Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a fierce commander who refused to yield. By May 1803, Napoleon faced the truth. The expedition had failed. The last French troops evacuated the island. In 1804, Dessalines declared the Independent Republic of Haiti, the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere, born through revolution against France. Meanwhile, events in Europe were shifting again. Relations with Britain deteriorated rapidly. The British refused to withdraw from Malta as promised. Napoleon annexed Piedmont, reorganized Switzerland through his act of mediation, occupied Holland, and hinted at ambitions in India. These moves alarmed London. War loomed once more, and Napoleon understood something Britain did not. If conflict was inevitable, France's North American colony of Louisiana would be impossible to defend. In need of funds for the coming war, Napoleon made a fateful decision. In 1803, he sold the entire Louisiana territory, over 2 million square kilometers, to the United States for $15 million. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the young republic and reshaped the map of North America forever. By May 1803, tensions with Britain finally snapped. Britain declared war. Napoleon responded forcefully, reassembling the invasion camp at Boulogne and ordering that every British male between ages 18 and 60 in French territory be arrested as a prisoner of war. Once again, the uneasy peace was shattered. Once again, Europe braced itself for conflict. And once again, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the center of it all, stronger, richer, and more determined than ever. As Napoleon's power expanded, so did the number of men who wished to see him fall. In February 1804, his police uncovered a dangerous royalist plot, one that aimed to kidnap or assassinate him. The conspiracy allegedly involved British support, the respected General Jean Moreau, and even a mysterious member of the Bourbon family. Whether the evidence was certain or not, the atmosphere of fear was real. Napoleon had survived countless battles, but now assassins stalked the shadows of Paris itself. Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister, subtle, calculating, and enormously influential, offered a suggestion that would shock Europe. He urged Napoleon to strike directly at the Bourbon royal line to send a message. Acting on this advice, Napoleon ordered the kidnapping of Louis-Antoine, Duke of Enghien, a young Bourbon prince living just across the border in the German state of Baden. French agents crossed into Baden, violating its sovereignty, and seized the Duke. He was dragged back to France, put before a secret military tribunal, and condemned to death despite a total lack of evidence linking him to the plot. Within hours, he was executed by firing squad. The killing of Enghien sent shockwaves across Europe. Monarchs were horrified. Royalists denounced Napoleon as a tyrant. Russia issued a formal protest. Even some of Napoleon's allies felt that a line had been crossed. But Napoleon's supporters believed the message was clear. The new order in France would not be threatened without consequence. The Duke's execution hastened the next step. If Napoleon could be so easily targeted, then France itself was at risk. His allies argued that only a hereditary system, one that ensured continuity and stability, could protect the nation. Constitutional monarchists preferred it, and many ordinary citizens, exhausted by revolution and instability, agreed. Napoleon listened. And on May 18, 1804, the Senate proclaimed what many now believed inevitable. A new constitution followed, formalizing the empire. The next day, Napoleon elevated 18 of his most trusted generals to the rank of Marshal of the Empire, titles meant to bind the military elites to his reign. France was no longer a republic in anything but name. A plebiscite held in June confirmed the empire, though the numbers were carefully manipulated. Official results claimed 3.5 million yes votes against just over 2,500 no. In truth, as many as 500,000 votes were fabricated, and turnout, only 35%, was lower than the previous plebiscite. Still, the illusion of national approval was maintained, and Napoleon pressed forward. Britain, Russia, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire refused to recognize him as emperor. Austria, however, struck a diplomatic bargain. In exchange for Napoleon acknowledging Francis I as Emperor of Austria, they recognized Napoleon's new title. Then came the moment that captured the imagination of the world. On December 2, 1804, Napoleon's coronation took place inside the grand vaults of Notre Dame Cathedral. Pope Pius VII himself traveled to Paris to officiate, a symbolic blessing for a new dynasty rising from revolutionary ashes. After the Pope anointed him, Napoleon performed an audacious gesture. He took the replica crown of Charlemagne into his own hands and placed it upon his own head. He crowned himself. It was a public declaration that his authority came not from ancient lineage or divine right, but from his own achievements. He then crowned Josephine, making her the second woman in French history to be anointed empress. Before the assembled nobles, soldiers, clergy, and officials, Napoleon swore an oath to defend the territory of France, uphold civil liberties, preserve the Concordat, respect freedom of worship, maintain the Legion of Honor, and govern for the glory and welfare of the French people. But ambition does not rest. On March 17, 1805, Napoleon declared himself King of Italy. At Milan's cathedral, he placed upon his head the ancient Iron Crown of Lombardy, a symbol of medieval kingship. To Austria, this was an unmistakable provocation. When Napoleon later annexed Genoa and Liguria, Austria protested openly, accusing him of violating the terms of the Treaty of Luneville. The empire was expanding rapidly. Tensions were rising once more, and Europe braced itself for conflict. Because Napoleon had not stopped rising, and the continent had not seen the last of his ambition. By 1805, Europe had once again turned against Napoleon. One by one, the great powers aligned with Britain, Sweden, Russia, Austria, Naples, and the Ottoman Empire, forming the Third Coalition. The continent braced for another immense conflict, and Napoleon understood that to survive, he would have to strike quickly and decisively. In the years 1803 and 1804, Napoleon had gathered an enormous army on the cliffs of Boulogne, preparing for an ambitious invasion of Britain. Though the invasion never took place, the troops he trained there became the foundation of a new, elite fighting force, the Grande Armée. Created in August 1805, the Grande Armée represented the pinnacle of Napoleonic warfare. At its inception, it consisted of about 200,000 soldiers, organized into 7 flexible corps supported by powerful artillery reserves, cavalry formations, and the Imperial Guard, an elite unit that served as Napoleon's personal strike force. By the time summer ended, the Grande Armée had expanded to 350,000 highly disciplined, battle-hardened troops commanded by some of Europe's finest officers. Napoleon planned one of the boldest maneuvers of his career. He intended to lure the Royal Navy away from the English Channel with a diversionary strike across the Atlantic, allowing his invasion barges to cross safely. But the plan unraveled when the British fleet scored a major victory at Cape Finisterre in July 1805. Instead of joining the French fleets at Brest, Admiral Villeneuve retreated to Cadiz, leaving Napoleon's invasion strategy in ruins. With Britain unassailable by sea and the coalition armies gathering on the continent, Napoleon shifted strategies instantly. He abandoned the invasion of England and turned the Grande Armée eastward. His goal was simple: crush the Austrian armies before their Russian allies could arrive. On September 25, 1805, more than 200,000 French soldiers began crossing the Rhine along a massive 260-kilometer front. The speed of their march stunned Europe. In southern Germany, Austrian commander Karl Mack von Leiberick had concentrated the bulk of his forces in the fortified city of Ulm. But Napoleon moved with breathtaking swiftness. The Grande Armée outmaneuvered and surrounded Mack's forces before they even understood the danger. After a series of sharp engagements, the trap closed. The Battle of Ulm ended with a humiliating Austrian surrender. Napoleon suffered only 2,000 casualties. In exchange, he captured 60,000 Austrian soldiers. It was one of the most brilliant operational victories of his career. Yet, even as France celebrated on land, tragedy struck at sea. On October 21st, 1805, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the combined French and Spanish navy at the Battle of Trafalgar. Nelson died in victory, and the French navy was shattered. From that moment forward, Britain's dominance at sea was unquestioned. Napoleon would never again seriously challenge the Royal Navy. But the emperor still ruled on land, and it was on land that he intended to decide the war. In November, French troops marched triumphantly into Vienna, seizing 100,000 muskets, 500 cannons, and securing the bridges over the Danube intact. The Austrian capital had fallen. Napoleon now moved north to meet the combined Russian and Austrian armies. The showdown came on December 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation, at a small town in Moravia called Austerlitz. The Battle of Austerlitz, often called the Battle of the Three Emperors, became Napoleon's masterpiece. Before dawn, he deliberately positioned his army below the Pratzen Heights, appearing weak on his right flank. He wanted the coalition to attack there. The Russians and Austrians took the bait, sending their troops downhill to strike what they believed to be the French weak point. At that moment, Napoleon unleashed his plan. The French center surged forward, capturing the Pratzen Heights and splitting the Allied army in two. French wings snapped shut like steel jaws, trapping the enemy in a massive pincer. Panic spread. Thousands of Russians fled onto a frozen lake, where artillery fire shattered the ice beneath them. Between 100 and 2,000 men drowned in the icy waters. When the battle ended, 1/3 of the Allied force had been killed, wounded, or captured. The coalition army was shattered. Austria sued for peace at once. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed on December 26, 1805, forced Austria to concede territory to Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy and to Bavaria. They paid an enormous indemnity of 40 million francs. The Russian army was permitted to withdraw in humiliation. Napoleon famously said afterward, "Austerlitz is the finest of all the battles I have fought." And indeed, it was the pinnacle of his military genius. Some historians claim the victory made him overconfident, perhaps even detached from reality, transforming French foreign policy into something driven more by Napoleon's personal ambition than by national interest. Others argue the opposite, that Napoleon merely carried the hopes of millions of French citizens who believed he embodied the glory and destiny of their nation. Whatever the truth, one fact was undeniable. Austerlitz raised Napoleon to the height of his power. It also marked the beginning of the next phase of his empire, one larger, more dazzling, and far more dangerous. Fresh from his victory at Austerlitz, Napoleon Bonaparte turned his attention toward a grand geopolitical vision, one he had imagined long before he became emperor. He still dreamed of reshaping the balance of power in the Middle East. If he could build a network of alliances stretching from Constantinople to Persia, he could pressure both Britain and Russia and possibly revive his earlier ambition of reaching India. In February 1806, his diplomatic campaign gained a symbolic triumph. Selim III, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, formally recognized Napoleon as Emperor of the French. More than that, Selim declared France to be the empire's sincere and natural ally. It was a historic moment. For centuries, France and the Ottomans had maintained a cautious but often cooperative relationship, united by their shared rivalry against Habsburg Austria. Napoleon hoped to revive this old partnership and turn it into a foundation for French influence across the East. But Napoleon's plans came with a price. By choosing to side with France, Selim III found himself dragged into a disastrous war against Britain and Russia, two enemies the Ottoman Empire was ill-prepared to fight. As French armies marched triumphantly across Europe, Ottoman forces struggled against Russian advances on their borders and British attacks in the Mediterranean. Napoleon also sought allies beyond Istanbul. In 1807, he established a Franco-Persian alliance with Fath Ali Shah Qajar, the ruler of the Persian Empire. At the Finkenstein Palace in West Prussia, the Iranian envoy Mirza Mohammad Reza Qazvini met with Napoleon and signed the Treaty of Finkenstein. The agreement promised French military support for Persia in its struggle against Russia, while Persia agreed to aid Napoleon's ambitions in the region, including pressure on India. For a brief moment, it seemed that Napoleon was on the verge of building a powerful Eastern coalition. But the dream would not last. Later that same year, Napoleon shocked the world by making peace with Russia. The treaties of Tilsit, signed in 1807, brought Emperor Alexander I into a sudden alliance with France, one that instantly nullified Napoleon's promises to Persia. The Franco-Persian alliance collapsed almost overnight. Persia, betrayed and isolated, turned its anger toward Britain instead. As for the Ottomans, they remained entangled in their war with Russia and Britain, receiving far less French support than they had expected. Napoleon's attention was focused increasingly on Europe, and his grand Middle Eastern strategy was left to crumble. In the end, despite his sweeping visions, Napoleon failed to establish any lasting alliances in the Middle East. The region slipped from his grasp, and he turned his energies back toward the struggles that awaited him on the European continent, a continent that would soon erupt again into war. The triumph at Austerlitz elevated Napoleon to unprecedented power. No longer merely the master of France, he reshaped the political map of Europe with startling speed. In early 1806, he removed the Bourbon monarchy from Naples and placed his elder brother Joseph on the throne. Soon after, he crowned his younger brother Louis King of Holland, turning the Netherlands into another branch of the Bonaparte dynasty. But Napoleon's grandest political creation came on 12th July 1806, when he dissolved centuries of tradition by forging the Confederation of the Rhine. This new alliance of German states acted as a buffer between France and Central Europe, but it also signaled something far more profound. By drawing these states into his orbit, Napoleon dealt the final blow to the Holy Roman Empire, a political structure that had endured for nearly 1,000 years. The old order of Europe was falling away. The Napoleonic era was being built atop its ruins. France's growing power alarmed Prussia. Once a respected continental force, Prussia felt itself increasingly overshadowed. Frederick William III, feeling humiliated and manipulated by Napoleon's diplomatic maneuvering, made a fateful decision. He declared war in 1806, joining Russia to form the Fourth Coalition. It was a grave miscalculation. Napoleon wasted no time. With 180,000 soldiers of the Grande Armée, now the most formidable army on earth, he marched rapidly along the right bank of the River Saale. The French were still in southern Germany when Prussia declared war, leaving the Prussians dangerously isolated and far from their Russian allies. Napoleon seized the opportunity. Learning the position of the Prussian army, he executed a sweeping maneuver that cut the Prussians off from Berlin and from the approaching Russians. Then, on the 14th of October, 1806, he unleashed the Grande Armée in two simultaneous battles, the Battle of Jena, the Battle of Auerstedt. The French smashed the Prussian forces in both engagements. The Prussian army, still operating under outdated tactics and led by commanders who underestimated Napoleon, collapsed under the speed and precision of the French assault. Several key officers were killed or severely wounded. King Frederick William III himself proved unable to coordinate the defense. In a matter of hours, one of Europe's traditional great powers had been brought to its knees. In the following weeks, French forces captured 140,000 Prussian soldiers and seized over 2,000 cannons. It was a stunning collapse. Yet even as Napoleon celebrated his land victories, tragedy struck again at sea. The British Royal Navy destroyed the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar, ending any hope Napoleon still had of challenging British naval supremacy. From that day forward, the seas belonged to Britain, but the continent belonged to Napoleon. By November, French troops entered Berlin. Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, the first component of the continental system, a grand economic strategy aimed at strangling Britain by forbidding European nations from trading with it. In practice, the system was widely ignored or undermined, but it revealed Napoleon's determination to dominate Europe completely. The campaign then shifted eastward. Napoleon marched into Poland, seeking to confront the Russian army. In February 1807, the French and Russians clashed at Eylau, A brutal winter battle fought in snow and fog. The outcome was a near stalemate, with horrific casualties on both sides. It was one of the few battles where Napoleon did not achieve a clear victory, and it haunted him. Both armies rested and regrouped. In June, they met again, first at Heilsberg, which proved indecisive, and then at Friedland on June 14th. There, Napoleon struck with devastating force. In a few hours of intense fighting, he shattered the Russian army, inflicting casualties of nearly 30%. Russian morale collapsed. Their generals realized they could not defeat Napoleon's strategic brilliance or the strength of the Grande Armée. Peace became the only option. On June 25, 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I met on a raft in the middle of the river Niemen at the town of Tilsit. Soldiers from both sides stood on the riverbanks, watching the unprecedented scene. Two emperors, enemies days earlier, now speaking amicably on a wooden platform floating between their armies. The treaties of Tilsit transformed Europe. Napoleon offered Russia surprisingly lenient terms. Russia would join the continental system, withdraw from Wallachia and Moldavia, surrender the Ionian Islands to France. Prussia, however, suffered brutally. Half of its territory and population were stripped away. Its lands were used to create the Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by Napoleon's brother Jérôme. The Duchy of Warsaw, a new Polish state under French influence. The Prussian treasury was bled dry with a crushing occupation cost of 1.4 billion francs. The humiliation burned deeply into the Prussian national soul, sowing seeds of future resistance. In Russia, too, the treaty was unpopular. Though Alexander accepted it, many in his court viewed Napoleon with suspicion and resentment. The alliance seemed destined to strain from the start. But for Napoleon, the Treaty of Tilsit marked the height of his power. Europe had been reorganized around his will. His empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Vistula. He returned to France after 300 days abroad, hailed as the master of the continent. The world seemed to belong to him. Yet beneath the surface, new storms were gathering, storms Napoleon could not yet see. After the triumph at Tilsit, Napoleon shifted his attention toward Portugal, a nation whose historic alliance with Britain made it reluctant to enforce his continental system. Determined to close every door through which British goods could enter Europe, he ordered General Jean-Andoche Junot to lead 24,000 French troops across the Pyrenees on the 17th of October, 1807. Spain, still presenting itself as an ally, allowed the French to pass. By November, Junot had marched into Lisbon, only to find that the Portuguese royal family, refusing to submit to French domination, had fled across the Atlantic to Brazil, escorted by their fleet. Napoleon had seized the capital, but not the monarchy, a symbolic failure beneath his apparent success. Events in Spain soon spiraled into a far greater crisis. In March 1808, internal turmoil produced a palace coup that forced King Carlos IV to abdicate in favor of his son, Fernando VII. Sensing the weakness of the Spanish court, Napoleon summoned both father and son to Bayonne. There, in a calculated display of pressure and manipulation, he forced each to renounce the throne. Then, in a stunning assertion of personal authority, he placed his elder brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. By this time, 120,000 French troops were spread throughout the Iberian Peninsula, and resentment among the Spanish population was growing rapidly. On the 2nd of May, 1808, Madrid exploded into open revolt. Ordinary civilians, men, women, and even children, rose against the French occupation. The uprising spread through the countryside, and the harsh reprisals ordered by French commanders only intensified Spanish resistance, transforming the revolt into a brutal, prolonged war. Joseph Bonaparte entered Madrid on 24th July, attempting to claim his crown. But the illusion of stability shattered when news arrived that a French army had been defeated by regular Spanish forces at the Battle of Baylen. The shock was immense. This was the first time in years that a French field force had surrendered, and the defeat sent Joseph fleeing from Madrid days after his arrival. Meanwhile, events in Portugal dealt another blow to French prestige. A British army landed in August 1808 and defeated Junot at the Battle of Vimiero. Under the Convention of Sintra, Junot's forces were forced to evacuate Portugal entirely. For the first time, Napoleon's empire showed signs of vulnerability. These setbacks convinced Napoleon that he needed to take personal command of the Iberian War. Before leaving France, he sought to secure his alliance with Russia, hoping Tsar Alexander I would agree to declare war on Austria if necessary. At the Congress of Erfurt in October 1808, the two emperors staged a grand display of unity and reaffirmed earlier agreements. Yet Alexander avoided giving any firm promise to support France militarily against Austria, a hesitancy that hinted at growing cracks in their alliance. In early November, Napoleon arrived in Vittoria and assumed command of a massive force of 240,000 French-led troops. With characteristic speed, he struck at the Anglo-Spanish armies, winning a string of victories that allowed him to enter Madrid once more on the 4th of December. Determined to destroy the remaining British forces, he pursued their retreating army across northern Spain. Yet the British executed a disciplined withdrawal and were evacuated from Corunna in January 1809. Napoleon had regained ground, but the campaign consumed time and energy he desperately needed elsewhere. On the 17th of January, he left Spain and returned to France, never again setting foot in the peninsula. His departure did not end the conflict. British forces, now under the command of Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, returned in April. Together with Spanish and Portuguese troops, they launched a determined resistance. Meanwhile, the Spanish countryside erupted into one of the first modern guerrilla wars. Villagers ambushed French patrols, rebel bands attacked supply lines, and brutal reprisals by French forces only fueled the cycle of violence. The war became a grinding, chaotic struggle marked by atrocities on both sides. Napoleon later admitted that the Peninsular War was the unlucky war that ruined me, for it drained France of manpower, morale, and resources. Between 1808 and 1812, as many as 300,000 French-led troops were tied down in Iberia. By 1814, the French were forced out entirely, leaving behind more than 150,000 dead or permanently lost. What had begun as a swift political maneuver became a slow, costly disaster that weakened the foundations of Napoleon's once dominant empire. The overthrow of the Spanish Bourbons sent shockwaves through Europe, and nowhere was the alarm greater than in Vienna. Austria watched with growing fear as Napoleon placed his brother on the Spanish throne and plunged the Iberian Peninsula into a brutal war. The French setbacks in Spain convinced Austrian leaders that Napoleon's empire might finally be vulnerable. Determined to reclaim lost prestige and reverse the humiliations of earlier defeats, Austria prepared once again for war. Before dawn on the 10th of April, 1809, the Austrian army surged across the Inn River and invaded Bavaria, hoping to strike a decisive blow before Napoleon could respond. But the campaign began chaotically. Austrian forces were spread too thin, their movements poorly coordinated, and their chance for a swift victory evaporated as the Bavarian army held out long enough for French reinforcements to arrive. Napoleon, alerted to the crisis, rushed from Paris and reached the front on the 17th of April. He quickly seized control of the situation, reorganizing his scattered forces and launching a counteroffensive. At the Battle of Eckmühl, Napoleon personally led attacks despite suffering a minor wound to his heel. The Austrians, outmaneuvered and pressured on multiple fronts, were forced to withdraw across the Danube. On 13th May, French troops marched into Vienna for the second time in 4 years. But it was a hollow triumph. The population had largely fled, and the retreating Austrians had blown up all 4 bridges across the river, leaving the French army stranded on the northern bank, facing a determined enemy. Napoleon attempted to force a crossing of the Danube on 21st May, triggering the fierce and bloody Battle of Aspern-Essling. The fighting raged for 2 days. Both armies suffered staggering losses of roughly 23,000 men each. For the first time in his career, Napoleon was forced to retreat from a major battle. Across Europe, capitals erupted with the news that the French emperor had suffered a genuine setback. The aura of invincibility Napoleon had built over a decade of victories suddenly appeared cracked. Refusing to accept defeat, Napoleon spent 6 weeks reinforcing his position, rebuilding bridges, and preparing for an overwhelming assault. In early July, he launched a second crossing that led directly to the massive Battle of Wagram on the 5th and 6th of July. The fighting stretched across miles of open fields, with artillery thundering day and night. When the smoke cleared, the Austrians were in retreat once more. But victory came at a terrible cost. Both armies suffered between 37,000 and 39,000 casualties. The French pursuit continued to the Battle of Znaim on the 10th of July, where Austria finally agreed to an armistice 2 days later. Meanwhile, in a misguided attempt to aid Austria, Britain launched an expedition to Holland in August. The campaign quickly degenerated into disaster. Disease ravaged the British ranks, killing 4,000 men before the force withdrew in December. The diversion achieved nothing and did little to change Austria's grim fate. In October 1809, the defeated empire was forced to sign the harsh Treaty of Schönbrunn. Austria lost vast territories and more than 3 million subjects. France absorbed Carinthia, Carniola, and the crucial Adriatic ports of Trieste and Fiume. The Duchy of Warsaw gained Austrian-held West Galicia, and Bavaria received the lands of the former Archbishopric of Salzburg. In addition to territorial losses, Austria was forced to pay an indemnity of 200 million francs and reduce its army to 150,000 men. The War of the Fifth Coalition had ended as all previous coalitions had. With Napoleon victorious, Europe reshaped, and Austria humbled once again. But beneath the surface, the cost of these constant wars was mounting, and Napoleon's empire, though powerful, was beginning to stretch dangerously thin. By the end of 1809, Napoleon stood at the peak of his political and military power, ruling a vast empire that stretched across the European continent. Yet behind the grandeur of conquest and ceremony, a personal crisis threatened the very future of his dynasty. His marriage to Josephine, whom he had loved passionately in earlier years, had failed to produce an heir. For Napoleon, whose empire depended on continuity and hereditary legitimacy, the absence of a child was a political danger more than a private sorrow. He needed a son, an heir who could secure the Bonaparte line and cement the new imperial order. In November 1809, Napoleon made the painful and calculated decision to end his marriage. With Josephine's reluctant consent, he publicly announced their divorce, emphasizing the political necessity of the act. The marriage was formally annulled in January 1810. Though the separation was dignified, it cast a shadow over their personal lives. Josephine left the Tuileries in tears, while Napoleon, despite his resolve, was said to be devastated for days afterward. But he wasted no time turning his attention to a new alliance. His first choice was the Russian imperial family. Negotiations began for a marriage to Grand Duchess Anna, the young sister of Tsar Alexander I. Yet the Tsar stalled, claiming Anna was too young, an excuse that thinly veiled his reluctance to bind Russia more tightly to Napoleon's increasingly domineering empire. With Russia drifting out of Napoleon's orbit, the French emperor pivoted toward Austria, his old adversary but now a humbled power after the Treaty of Schönbrunn. The Austrians, recognizing the political benefit of proximity to Napoleon, quickly accepted the proposal. Napoleon would marry Marie-Louise, the daughter of Emperor Francis I, forging a union that symbolized a dramatic shift in European diplomacy. The war-torn bitterness of past decades gave way, at least briefly, to an alliance sealed not by force, but by marriage. On April 1, 1810, the civil ceremony took place in Paris. The following day, in the lavish halls of the Louvre, a grand religious wedding was performed. The spectacle dazzled Europe. Napoleon, the self-made emperor, had joined one of the oldest royal houses on the continent. The message was unmistakable. France was no longer a revolutionary upstart, but a central pillar of the European order. This union soon fulfilled its purpose. On the 20th of March 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, François Charles-Joseph Napoleon. The newborn was granted the title King of Rome, a name that echoed imperial grandeur and hinted at a future legacy. Napoleon viewed the child as the embodiment of his dynasty, the symbol of a future he believed he had secured. Meanwhile, the French Empire continued to expand. Through a series of annexations, most notably of the Papal States in 1809 and 1810, Holland in July 1810, and the northern coastal regions of Westphalia in August, Napoleon extended his direct control over vast stretches of Europe. By this point, he ruled, either directly or through satellite kingdoms, nearly 40% of the population of the continent. Brothers, sisters, and loyal marshals sat on thrones from Italy to Westphalia, and French law, French administration, and French influence reached farther than ever before. To the outside world, Napoleon's power appeared unshakable. He had a young heir, a prestigious marriage alliance, and an empire without rival. Yet beneath the surface, the stresses were mounting. The alliances he forged were fragile. The expansion of his empire bred resentment, and the uneasy peace with Russia, strained by ambition, pride, and conflicting interests, was beginning to fracture. The emperor had secured his dynasty. But Europe's next great conflict was already gathering beyond the horizon. Tsar Alexander I watched Napoleon's growing empire with rising suspicion and resentment. Each new move by the French emperor seemed designed to tighten a noose around Russia. The creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, built from former Polish lands so close to Russia's border, looked like a deliberate attempt to resurrect a hostile Polish state. Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria signaled a new alliance that threatened to isolate Russia diplomatically. And when the French Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, once an enemy of Russia, was elected Crown Prince of Sweden, Alexander saw it as yet another maneuver designed to box Russia in. The final insult came in December 1810, when Napoleon annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, whose duke was Alexander's uncle. Offended and increasingly wary of French intentions, the Tsar retaliated by loosening the continental system. He allowed neutral ships to dock in Russian ports and placed restrictions on French goods. Russia feared that Napoleon ultimately intended to restore a full Polish kingdom on its frontier, while Napoleon grew convinced that Russia was drifting toward an alliance with Britain, a possibility he would not tolerate. By late 1811, the fragile peace between the two empires had shattered in all but name. Napoleon began preparing for what he believed would be a short, decisive campaign against Russia. In February 1812, he compelled Prussia into a reluctant alliance, forcing it to send 20,000 soldiers to support the invasion. Austria followed in March, agreeing to provide 30,000 troops. With these additions, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. His Grande Armée, drawn from across the French Empire and its satellite states, numbered around 450,000 frontline soldiers. Only one-third were French. The rest came from Italy, Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, and even reluctant allies. Napoleon referred to the coming invasion as the Second Polish War, yet he refused to promise the Poles a fully restored kingdom, fearing that such a commitment would drive Austria and Prussia into open defiance. On 24th June 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River and entered Russian territory. Napoleon expected to win the war quickly, drawing the Russians into one or two decisive battles. Instead, the Russians fell back, first to the Dvina River, then deeper into the interior, destroying crops, supplies, and entire villages as they retreated. Their scorched earth strategy denied the French the food, forage, and shelter they desperately needed. As the French advanced, the land behind them seemed to turn to ash. On August 18th, Napoleon captured Smolensk after a costly battle that left 9,000 of his men dead or wounded. But again, the Russian army slipped away intact. The decisive battle Napoleon longed for finally came on the 7th of September at Borodino, just west of Moscow. Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov made his stand, and the two armies collided in one of the bloodiest battles in European history. By nightfall, 44,000 Russians and 35,000 French soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The Russians withdrew under cover of darkness, allowing Napoleon to claim victory. But it was a victory drained of triumph. He later confessed that Borodino was the most terrible of all his battles, praising both sides for fighting with unparalleled ferocity. On the 14th of September, Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. Instead, the city erupted into flames. Fires set by order of Moscow's governor, Fyodor Rostopchin, tore through the wooden city for days, destroying 3/4 of it and leaving Napoleon's army in a burned-out ruin. Still, Alexander refused to negotiate. For 6 futile weeks, Napoleon waited in Moscow, hoping the Tsar would bend. But winter was approaching and no peace came. Finally, on the 19th of October, Napoleon ordered the retreat. It was the beginning of a catastrophe. As the French army withdrew along devastated roads, they were harassed by Cossack cavalry, ambushed by armed peasants, and ravaged by hunger, disease, and freezing temperatures. At Maloyaroslavets, they won a bloody victory, but it only forced them back onto the already ravaged Smolensk road. Between late October and early November, tens of thousands died in what became a nightmare march. When the shattered remains of the army reached Smolensk on the 9th of November, only 40,000 to 50,000 soldiers remained, out of the 100,000 who had begun the retreat 3 weeks earlier. On the same day, Napoleon received alarming news. A general named Claude François de Mallet had nearly seized power in Paris during a daring coup attempt, falsely announcing Napoleon's death. Though the coup failed, it rattled the emperor deeply. His empire, it seemed, could not survive even rumors of his absence. Pressed by danger at home and the collapse of his army abroad, Napoleon abandoned the retreating remnants of the Grande Armée on the 5th of December and raced back to Paris. In the following weeks, what remained of the army struggled across the frozen Berezina River under constant Russian attack, enduring temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius. Miraculously, around 75,000 survivors eventually crossed back into friendly territory, but they were a shadow of the force that had marched so confidently into Russia 6 months earlier. The Russian army had lost as many as 300,000 men. Combined military deaths on both sides approached 1 million. Yet it was Napoleon's forces that suffered the greater collapse, militarily, politically, and psychologically. The invasion that was meant to break Russia instead broke the Grande Armée, and the consequences would soon unravel the entire Napoleonic Empire. As the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée limped out of Russia in the winter of 1812 to 1813, the balance of power in Europe shifted dramatically. Napoleon's enemies recognized the moment and seized it. While the French withdrew through Poland and Prussia, hounded by Russian forces and struggling to rebuild after the disaster, old adversaries sensed weakness and prepared to strike. In March 1813, both Sweden and Prussia declared war on France, joining Russia in a new alliance that would become the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon, unwilling to accept defeat, rushed to rebuild an army. By April, he had assembled a force of 200,000 men, many of them barely trained recruits. Yet he still possessed the drive and strategic brilliance that had once conquered Europe. He personally took command and won hard-fought victories at Lutzen and Bautzen, temporarily halting the coalition advance. But these victories were costly, and the losses were harder to replace than ever before. Britain formally entered the coalition in June, and Austria, encouraged by France's growing vulnerability, followed in August. Though Napoleon won another major victory at Dresden that same month, the strategic tide had turned. The Allies now enjoyed overwhelming superiority in manpower, cavalry, and supplies. Every victory Napoleon won only delayed the inevitable reckoning. That reckoning came in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, the largest confrontation of the Napoleonic Wars, and later known as the Battle of the Nations. Over several brutal days, Napoleon faced a coalition force far larger than his own. The fighting was catastrophic. While the coalition lost 54,000 men, the French lost 38,000 killed or wounded and 15,000 taken prisoner. Tens of thousands more were lost during the chaotic retreat toward the Rhine, killed, captured, or simply disappearing into the countryside through illness, exhaustion, or desertion. Leipzig marked the beginning of the end of Napoleon's empire. Despite his defeats, the Allies offered Napoleon peace in November 1813. Under the Frankfurt proposals, he would remain emperor, but France would be reduced to its natural frontiers, losing Spain, Holland, Italy, and Germany, but retaining Belgium, Savoy, and the west bank of the Rhine. For many leaders in Europe, this compromise seemed fair and preferable to endless bloodshed. But Napoleon refused. Still convinced he could turn the situation around, he gambled on one more campaign, one he believed could restore France's dominance. The Allies responded decisively. On January 1, 1814, coalition armies crossed the Rhine into French territory. That same winter, Wellington's British forces surged across the Pyrenees into southwest France. Napoleon, facing invasion from multiple directions, assembled about 70,000 troops to defend his empire against a coalition force of nearly 200,000. Though he suffered a defeat at La Rothière, he launched a brilliant, desperate counteroffensive in February, winning a string of battles that temporarily forced the Allies to reconsider their strategy. Once again, they offered peace, this time on the more generous basis of France's 1791 borders. Still, Napoleon refused to yield, but willpower could not overcome mathematics. In March 1814, coalition armies advanced relentlessly. After fierce fighting, Napoleon was pushed back at the Battle of Arcus-sur-Aube, and the Allied commanders agreed on their next objective, Paris itself. The capital's defense fell to Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, who faced impossible odds. On 29 March, a coalition force of 200,000 men attacked the defenses at Belleville and Montmartre. That evening, Empress Marie-Louise fled Paris with her young son, the King of Rome. Only 38,000 French troops remained to protect the capital. With no hope of salvation, Joseph authorized Marshal Auguste de Marmont to surrender on 31st March. The next day, Paris fell. On 2nd April, the Senate declared Napoleon deposed and accepted Charles Maurice de Talleyrand as head of a provisional government. Meanwhile, Napoleon, stationed at Fontainebleau with an army of 40,000 to 60,000, considered marching on Paris to retake the city. But his marshals, exhausted and disillusioned, refused to follow him. On the 4th of April, they persuaded him to abdicate in favor of his son, with Marie-Louise as regent. Tsar Alexander, unwilling to accept any compromise that left Napoleon's family in power, demanded an unconditional abdication. On the 6th of April, 1814, Napoleon yielded. His empire had slipped away, but his devotion to his soldiers remained unbroken. On the 20th of April, he delivered a final address to the Old Guard, the men who had followed him from Italy to Egypt, from Austerlitz to Moscow. His voice trembled as he spoke of their shared glories, their sacrifices, their loyalty. He told them he was giving up the fight not because they were defeated, but because continuing the war would plunge France into civil ruin. He urged them not to mourn for him, but to serve France with honor. Then, calling them his children, he embraced the eagle standard one last time. His farewell echoed through the courtyard of Fontainebleau as he prepared to leave for exile on the island of Elba. Thus ended the reign of the man who once ruled Europe. Napoleon's fall from power ended not in execution or imprisonment, but in a curious compromise that turned him from master of Europe into sovereign of a tiny Mediterranean island. Under the Treaty of Fontainebleau in April 1814, he was exiled to Elba, a small island of barely 12,000 people lying just off the Tuscan coast. Once the treaty was signed, he prepared to leave France behind forever. Yet even before he reached Elba, the strain of defeat weighed heavily on him. On the night after the abdication, he attempted to end his life with the poison he had carried since the retreat from Russia. But the substance had weakened with time, and instead of dying, he survived, shaken and physically ill, to face exile alone. His wife, Marie-Louise, and his son had taken refuge in Austria, and he knew they would not be returning to his side. He was transported on the British ship HMS Undaunted and arrived at Portoferraio on the 4th of May, 1814. Crowds gathered to see him, some curious, others sympathetic, all aware that this strange little island was now the realm of a man who had once ruled half of Europe. Napoleon, still driven by the energy that had shaped his empire, immediately threw himself into work. He inspected the island, drafted plans for new roads, set about repairing buildings, and explored ways to improve mining, agriculture, and trade. His mind operated as though he were still administering a continent. But Elba was too small, its resources too limited, and the work too slow to satisfy a man used to commanding vast armies. Funding was scarce, and many of his ambitious improvements remained unrealized. In late May, devastating news reached him. Josephine, the woman who had once been the center of his world, had died in France. The loss struck him harder than he expected. He shut himself inside his room for 2 days, refusing to speak to anyone. Isolation, grief, and the humiliation of exile wore down the disciplined mask he had always presented to the world. The island that had once seemed like a manageable domain now felt like a prison. Meanwhile, across the sea in France, Louis XVIII was struggling to win the loyalty of the population. Reports reaching Elba told Napoleon that the Bourbon Restoration was deeply unpopular, that many soldiers longed for their former emperor, and that the government in Paris was plagued with suspicion, resentment, and missteps. Napoleon listened carefully to every rumor. He also learned that his promised allowance from France had been cut off, leaving him financially undermined. More troubling were whispers that the Allies were considering sending him even farther away, possibly to a remote island in the Atlantic where escape would be unthinkable. The thought of being taken from Elba, removed from any influence or possibility of return, chilled him far more than the tiny island's confinement ever had. Napoleon realized that his future, his legacy, and even his safety would vanish if he did nothing. With France restless, the political order fragile, and his own prospects shrinking, he decided that exile was no longer acceptable. On 26 February 1815, after months of watching, planning, and waiting for the perfect opportunity, Napoleon made his move. With the help of loyal officers and island supporters, he slipped away from Elba aboard the Brigand Constant, accompanied by about 1,000 followers and a small flotilla of 7 vessels. The people of Portoferraio watched him depart with a mixture of awe and disbelief, unsure whether they were witnessing the beginning of a daring return or the last reckless gamble of a fallen emperor. Either way, Napoleon had set his course. France lay before him once more. Napoleon's escape from Elba set in motion one of the most astonishing political comebacks in history. On the 1st of March 1815, he and his small band of followers landed at Gulf Juan on the French coast. With no official army, no supplies, and no guarantee of support, he marched north toward Grenoble through the rugged foothills of the Alps, following the route that later became known as the Route Napoleon. Every step was a gamble, yet he trusted that the nation he had once led would still recognize him. South of Grenoble, the first true test came. The 5th Regiment, sent to stop him, blocked the road. Napoleon walked forward alone, placing himself directly before the muskets aimed at him. Throwing open his coat, he called to the soldiers that if they wished to kill their emperor, they should do it now. For a moment, the scene held its breath. Then the silence shattered. Cries of "Vive l'Empereur" rose from the ranks, and the troops marched over and joined him. Word of this encounter raced ahead of him, and with every mile, the legend of his return grew. On 14th March, Marshal Ney, who had sworn he would deliver Napoleon to Paris in an iron cage, switched sides and brought 6,000 men to join him. By then, the nation was awakening with excitement, old loyalties stirring beneath the surface. But abroad, the reaction was far different. On 13th March, as news reached the Congress of Vienna, the great powers declared Napoleon an outlaw. 4 days later, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia pledged massive armies, 150,000 men each, to crush him once and for all. None of this stopped the momentum sweeping through France. Louis XVIII, knowing he lacked the loyal forces needed to resist, fled Paris in the early hours of the 20th of March. That same evening, Napoleon entered the capital, not as a fugitive but greeted by cheering crowds. He formed a new government and ordered constitutional reforms, which were approved by plebiscite in May. A new Chamber of Representatives was elected shortly afterward, though on a restricted property franchise. With diplomacy impossible and the coalition powers marching toward him, Napoleon focused all his energy on raising an army. Without legal authority to impose conscription, he gathered roughly 300,000 men, many of them raw recruits or hastily assembled National Guards. On 12th June, Napoleon led the newly formed Army of the North, about 124,000 strong, across the frontier into Belgium. His plan was bold. Drive a wedge between Wellington's Anglo-Dutch-German army of 112,000 and Blücher's Prussian-Saxon force of 130,000, defeating them separately before they could unite. Initial clashes at Ligny and Quatre Bras set the stage for the decisive confrontation that followed. On the 18th of June at Waterloo, Napoleon launched repeated assaults upon Wellington's defensive line, but the British commander held firm. Late in the day, the Prussians arrived on Napoleon's exposed right flank. Their sudden weight tipped the balance. French formations crumbled, and one of history's most famous defeats took shape on the rain-soaked fields of Belgium. Napoleon returned to Paris to find that the political atmosphere had collapsed around him. The legislature openly opposed him, and even his supporters accepted that further resistance was impossible. On 22nd June, he abdicated for the second time, this time in favor of his young son. Leaving Paris 3 days later, he withdrew to Josephine's former residence at Malmaison, a place filled with personal memories and the ghosts of an earlier, more hopeful era. His situation, however, grew rapidly more dangerous. Prussian forces advanced relentlessly, and by 28th June, they were at Senlis, just north of Paris. When Napoleon learned that the Prussian army had orders to seize him dead or alive, he fled to the port of Rochefort with the idea of escaping to the United States. For several anxious days he waited, only to discover that the British Navy had sealed every exit. With no route left, he chose to surrender peacefully. On the 15th of July, 1815, he boarded the British ship HMS Bellerophon and gave himself up to Captain Frederick Lewis Maitland, ending the 100 days and closing the final chapter of his rule. After surrendering to the British, Napoleon was placed under strict custody and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the remote island of St. Helena, over 1,000 nautical miles from the west coast of Africa. In October 1815, he arrived at Jamestown aboard HMS Northumberland, accompanied by 27 loyal followers. The British took no chances. A garrison of more than 2,000 soldiers guarded the island, and a squadron of 10 ships patrolled the surrounding waters without pause, ensuring that escape was impossible. Rumors of plots circulated throughout the coming years, yet none ever developed beyond whispers. For the first weeks, he lived at the Briars, a small pavilion on the estate of the Balcombe family, before being transferred to the residence chosen for him, Longwood House. Though large with 40 rooms, it was damp, wind-lashed, infested with rats, and notorious for its unhealthy climate. British newspapers speculated openly that the conditions were intended to hasten his decline. Napoleon himself complained frequently in letters to the island's governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, while his companions spoke of endless colds, damp floors, and inadequate supplies. Despite captivity, Napoleon maintained the ritual and dignity of imperial life. Dinner guests were expected to appear in military uniform or elegant evening dress, as though attending a court rather than a prison. He continued to receive visitors formally, read extensively, and dictated memoirs and commentaries on his campaigns. For a brief period, he attempted to learn English under the instruction of Emmanuel de las Casas, but abandoned the effort, frustrated by his own difficulties with languages. Stories of his hardships were deliberately circulated by Napoleon in the hope that public sympathy might pressure the Allied powers to revise his sentence. Governor Lowe, following orders, restricted expenditures, refused to acknowledge Napoleon's imperial titles, and required his companions to guarantee that they would remain with him indefinitely. Reports of these measures reached Britain and helped spark a debate in Parliament in 1817, where Lord Holland called for a public inquiry into the treatment of the former emperor. Napoleon's health began to deteriorate around the same time. His physician, Barry O'Meara, diagnosed chronic hepatitis and warned that the harsh climate and lack of exercise endangered his life. Lowe dismissed O'Meara in 1818, suspecting exaggeration. Later that year, the Allied powers declared that Napoleon would remain on St. Helena for life. When he learned of this irrevocable decision, his spirits collapsed. He withdrew increasingly into seclusion, spending long hours alone in his rooms, which only worsened his condition. One by one, members of his entourage departed the island. Las Cases was expelled in 1816, General Gourgaud left in 1818, and Albin de Montholon, widely believed to have become Napoleon's lover, departed in 1819. By late 1819, his household was a shadow of what it had once been, though two priests and the physician François Carlo Antomarchi arrived to join the dwindling retinue. Isolated, aging, and increasingly unwell, Napoleon endured the final years of his life on the lonely plateau of Longwood, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the South Atlantic. Napoleon's health declined steadily during his final months on St. Helena, and by March 1821, he was almost constantly bedridden. In April, sensing that the end was near, he dictated two wills in which he blamed the English oligarchy for his death, predicted the fall of the Bourbons, and imagined a future in which his son would once more rule France. He distributed his remaining fortune among 97 beneficiaries and expressed a final wish to be buried beside the Seine, in the country he had once governed with unmatched authority. On May 3rd, he received the last rites but was too weak to take communion. 2 days later, on May 5th, 1821, Napoleon died at the age of 51. Those gathered at his bedside recorded differing versions of his final words, though all were variations on the same theme: France, the army, and the memory of Josephine. Both his personal physician, Antomarchi, and the British doctors conducted autopsies, and though their reports were written separately, they reached the same conclusion. Napoleon had succumbed to internal bleeding caused by stomach cancer, the same illness that had taken his father's life. Later theories speculated that he had been poisoned with arsenic after unusually high levels were discovered in strands of his hair. Further analyses, however, revealed similarly high levels of arsenic in hair from his childhood, from his son, and from Josephine, reflecting the widespread presence of arsenic in 19th century medicines and cosmetic products. Modern pathology studies have again affirmed stomach cancer as the cause of death. Napoleon was buried with full military honors in the Valley of the Geraniums on the island. His heart and intestines were removed during the autopsy and sealed within the inner coffin, and rumors persisted for generations that other parts of his body had been removed as well. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1840, King Louis-Philippe of France secured British permission to bring Napoleon's remains back to France. When the coffin was opened, the body was found remarkably well preserved, protected by 4 nested coffins, 2 metal and 2 mahogany, enclosed within a stone vault. On December 15, 1840, Paris witnessed a state funeral of extraordinary scale, with crowds estimated between 700,000 and 1 million lining the route to Les Invalides. The coffin was placed temporarily in the chapel of Saint-Jérôme, while a monumental new tomb, designed by Louis Visconti, was constructed. In 1861, under the reign of Napoleon III, the emperor's remains were finally laid to rest in the great red quartzite sarcophagus beneath the dome of Les Invalides, where they remain today, an enduring symbol of a life that reshaped Europe and still captivates history.